Uh, um, I've loved cars, and it was part of our culture. And hot rods, it was the age of really hot rods. And as I said, I'd spent some time on the farm, so I started learning how to drive tractors and all that sort of stuff when I was 5 or 6 years old. And got my first ticket when I was 15. And the humor of that is that the newspaper after the court settlement was a juvenile was fined $7.50 for driving without a license. Bertha Fievez was fined $25 for allowing her son to drive without a license. and so the ribbing that went on was just great. I went to California when I was 16 to see my mother's older sister who was living in San Diego. And while there, I bought a 1940 Ford Coupe and and drove it home, raced it all the way home with my, picked up my cousin and I had gone down together, and we raced cars all the way back. And you still remember that Cadillac, beating this Cadillac up to Mount Shasta. When I got home, it had what was called a flathead Merc in it, and a flathead is where the valves are in the engine. And it was the time of the transition between a flathead with valves in the engine or an overhead valve engine, which is what all engines are these days. And the Chrysler products came out with what was called a Hemi head. It was a hemispherical combustion chamber in the head of this engine. And whereas the Ford engines had about 100 horsepower and the Mercury engine had about 150 horsepower, this thing had 350 horsepower. And so I bought this engine up in Yakima, and I was working at a box boy in a grocery store, and every night after school and after working as a box boy, I'd go and work until midnight or after, putting this engine in this guy's garage. And we put the engine in, and we put what was called a LaSalle transmission. A LaSalle is the junior brother of a Cadillac back in 1930s and 40s. But it had the best transmission that you could get. And then we put in an Oldsmobile rear end, which had a different type of a spring system. And so I put that together in my junior year, and then had to figure out a place to race. And I figured I could turn some pretty good numbers. And that was really in the days of drag racing. And drag racing, for those of you who weren't around in those days, is where there's two cars sitting there and the signal to go, whether it's the stoplight that changes or a guy with a flag, and you race for a quarter of a mile and see who can beat. And it turns out that I could turn about 115 to 120 in a quarter mile. And that was for a street rod, and a street rod is defined as an engine that has not been modified to the point where that you can still drive it down the street. Mine was totally stock. I mean, I didn't have to do anything else to it. So I just really had a lot of fun. And for those of you who are watching this know about Richland, Washington, you'll know that downstream there's a place called, after the confluence of the Yakima, there's a place called the Richland Y. And then there's that Columbia Park that goes all the way from the Richland Y to the bridge between Kennewick and Pasco. And it's a windy road, and it's a beautiful, beautiful park, but there is one spot that's about a half a mile long. And so I basically put the thing together, but got some other guys to help me. We put together went down and painted a white line across the road, and marked off exactly a quarter mile and painted another white line. And then they went to some of the girls in home education or home economics, I guess home economics, and had them sew up black and white flags to match. And then, we knew that the cops would be after us, and so our trick was that we went to I went to an Army-Navy surplus store and bought flare guns, and we bought two different flare bullets, I guess you'd call them. One was yellow and one was red, and the yellow one we would shoot into the air. We get a volunteer to sit up the roadways, and the volunteer would, if some little old lady was coming by, and we were kind of nervous that she might get caught in the traffic, particularly the oncoming traffic. If she was coming from where the finish line would end, we'd be racing at about 100 miles an hour. We didn't want to run into somebody. They'd shoot the yellow flare. But if it was a cop drove past, the red flare would go up. The second the red flare would go up, everybody just stopped their car. Everybody got out of their car. Everybody raised their hoods and stood there looking into the hood, talking very scientifically about what kind of an engine you had. And it happened several times. And finally, state troopers would sit up on the bypass up there and watch us race. And so finally, we probably stopped them from coming in about 4 or 5 times. And finally, they figured it out, and the guy hid in the bushes. He actually told me later that he had taken some trees and put them over, some bushes and put them over his car so that he wouldn't recognize it, and took out after me as I was heading down the thing, and I got a ticket for 90 miles an hour in a 25 zone. And I was racing down there, and here's this cop coming behind me, and I said, "Oh, not a problem." And I just headed down the road. I'll ditch this guy, no problem. But they had put a couple of cop cars across, and so I screamed and flipped a U-ey and headed back the other direction, and they put another cop car at the other end, and so got caught, and my dear, poor, wonderful, charming mother had to go to court with me. But the good news is that the cop really got frustrated when, after telling the judge what all had happened, that the judge got interested. Got very intrigued, and just kind of loved the story, and said, "Well, you got to quit your racing, and we put you on probation, and if you get caught again, you're really in trouble. But for now, so that's the difference. I mean, I can't imagine anybody not getting handcuffed and drug off to jail now, but that's what happened then, and it was so I have some really positive feelings about it, albeit with the mess that we made of Hanford and other things.